We're consolidating departments, reinventing workflows. The CFO kept glancing at the pale blue note card, shaking slightly in his fingers, his voice losing confidence with every buzzword. He spoke like he was hoping if he said enough nothing phrases, I wouldn't hear what he was really saying. But I heard it. I felt it in my ribs before he even got to the part where he said, "Your role has been absorbed." That was the word he picked, absorbed. My name is Mark Halper. I'm 51 years old. For the past 19 years, I was the lead strategist for supply chain optimization at Weldon Elix, a global logistics firm based out of Chicago. I created the architecture for our smart distribution networks, every node, every scheduling coefficient, every dynamic constraint that carved millions off our operating costs year over year. I wasn't a consultant. I wasn't floating. I was the guy, the engine they built this thing around. Now, I was sitting in a glass office that still smelled faintly like the lavender pouches the cleaning staff tucked behind the monitors, listening to a guy half my age bungle his way through a script drafted by legal. I had trained his predecessor. Hell, I'd mentored most of the senior team above him. Their boxes got shinier as we streamlined the supply algorithm. Mine just got heavier, but I never minded. I built things that worked, things that kept trucks moving and warehouses lean. I didn't need applause. Just accuracy. That morning, I had come in early, like I always did. Coffee, barely warm. The West monitors flashing rollout projections for our new Beloit distribution hub. Meme-laced Slack threads pinged quietly behind me, interns shouting emoji battle cries in response to someone posting a bug. I had just run a live sim on the multi-region load balance when HR asked me to drop by upstairs. I wasn't naive. I'd noticed the patterns forming blackout spots on team emails, sponsor requests rerouted, small omissions in the meeting notes that used to land reliably on my desk. The new AI strategy team had been changing configuration documentation without CECing me. At first I thought maybe it was a mistake, but then passive phrases like legacy phase-out and redundancy alignment started popping up in internal memos, not even addressed to me, just floating in the ether like a whisper. Still, I held on to a naive sliver. Somewhere between the third and fourth time, my logic trees popped up in a presentation without attribution. I told myself it wasn't personal. Maybe this was simply the evolution of modern infrastructure automation superseding people, even those who invented it. But there, in that chair, across from that trembling note-take card, I could feel my pulse slow. Not in anger, in clarity. 19 years. I was here before the touchscreens, before the cloud dashboards, before anyone in the building knew what predictive dispatching even meant. I had to convince our former CEO that preemptively routing shipments could offset storm delays. He thought it sounded like cheating. He laughed when I said we'd beat the coastal distribution algorithms by 3 days. Then we did by 5. We were a joke in overseas logistics. Then my framework started feeding daily adjustments into our primary scheduling system. Within 12 months, we were pulling contracts from bigger firms because our fulfillment rate ticked above 98.4%. I remember Patricia, our then VP of Operations, shaking her head after a quarterly review and saying, "Whatever weird math you're doing, don't stop." That math became the model. I still remembered scribbling the earliest prototypes in code on legal pads at 3 a.m., tweaking constraint logic between tequila shots and fried rice containers. Those nights meant something. Every diminished carry weight reduction, every warehouse toggle rule. It wasn't code to me, it was architecture with memory. Alive systems that learned. AI may have helped automate it, but the strategy was human, mine, and now they were wiping it off the table. They'll probably offer you a consulting deal, the HR partner had said weekly on my way out. Some gentle transition, as if I was a couch they were giving away with a polite Craigslist listing, very soft cushions. Slightly outdated fabric. I nodded, took the manila envelope they handed me. It felt heavier than it should have been, mostly paper and implication. No one offered to walk me out, which was a grace I didn't know I'd want until I was halfway down the hall. A few of the newer hires looked up as I passed, then quickly away. The ones I had trained kept their eyes firmly on screens, pretending not to notice. There was no final nod, no handshake, just the sterile hush of Monday stillness, and the proprietary software humming in the background, still running the model that bore my fingerprints in every line, They had phased me out, yes, but they hadn't stopped using my strategy. Not even close. It started so gradually I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The first time my name was missing from the distribution strategy deck, I thought it was a formatting issue. Maybe someone had used an old template. Then I noticed it was missing again the following week, and the week after that. Not even buried in the appendix where they used to tuck credit like a footnote. Nothing. My slides were there, my predictive matrices cloned, slightly rebranded, color scheme updated. But the structure was unmistakably mine. Still, no Mark Halper in the speaker's notes. Some grinning junior associate I'd onboarded 18 months ago was taking questions on a model I designed before she'd finished grad school. Then came the meetings where I wasn't invited. Status updates I used to run were suddenly moved to a smaller task force. My corner of the project folder disappeared. Slack channels I'd created went quiet. When I dropped in to ask clarifying questions, the replies had the stink of corporate compliance. We'll circle back. Let's sync next sprint. Appreciate your flexibility. The invitations stopped coming altogether after that. By then, I couldn't ignore it. I was being erased in slow motion. The AI division reorganized under the CTO's office, which they claimed was part of streamlining capacity alignment. They spun it with a glossy internal memo, full of agile jargon and a tasteful gradient header. In truth, it meant that the black box platforms I had helped prototype were now operated by analysts who talked more about storytelling algorithms than operational thresholds. When I requested a review of shifting decision matrices formality more than anything, they sent me a PDF titled Integration Brief, Legacy Logic Transfer, with not a single mention of the foundational architecture. Just a generic nod to historical frameworks. In 2 clicks, I recognized my conditional routing path. Sure, variables had been relabeled and reordered, some functions packaged better for presentation, but it was still my blueprint. Cloned, repackaged, and handed off like some orphaned code dump. I walked the floor the next morning, slower than usual. Tried to make eye contact with the folks I had trained. Some met my glance, gave a small nod, then returned to their screens as if they hadn't. Others didn't even try. One guy, Brady, he used to call me Halps, like we were buddies, actually stood up to get coffee when I came within arm's reach of his row. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. Just hollow. Like watching your reflection walk away without you. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. Kept showing up. Beard getting a little grayer. Daily check-ins getting more polite. I knew all of us in long-haul strategy did that things shift. But there's shifting, and then there's this. Being watched as if you're a slowly falling statue they can't move until the insurance paperwork goes through. When my access credentials were downgraded accidentally, I filed a ticket. IT said they'd look into it. They never did. When the system stopped pulling in my meta tags for real-time SIM monitoring, I emailed support. Do nothing. By that point, even our old devs people I'd mentored, pulled out of grad school programs and taught the structure of adaptive ranking, were hesitant to loop me in. Then came the final transition call, HR and some VP I barely knew. They used terms like evolving needs and team recalibration. They said my skill profile didn't reflect the future state model. That phrase landed like a clean break. I didn't respond. I just nodded, thanked them for the opportunity, and gathered my things. I returned my badge on a Tuesday. 4:43 p.m. I remember the time because I'd looked at my watch a strange number of times that day, as if once this moment passed, time would no longer have a rhythm I recognized. The front desk agent didn't even glance up as I handed it over. No smile, no parting words. Just scanned it, dropped it into a metal drawer, and went back to her keyboard. I walked to the elevator, past a floor I no longer belonged to. 47 steps to the glass doors I'd once lobbied to install for better team transparency. Every footfall felt like a ledger entry. Dev hours mentored, automation triggers designed, crises averted with after-hours patching, scores tallied, unacknowledged. In the farewell packet they gave me, the cover sheet read, Transition Report for Mark Halper. Underneath, a column labeled Status, listed me as Legacy Consultant, Phase-Out Complete. Phase-Out Complete. Not Former Department Lead, not Principal Architect. Not even a final thanks for your service. Just a clean status field. like a data object cleared from memory binary, bloodless. The strangest thing, somewhere in the building, the AI model was still running, the one I built, still calling shots based on the embedded strategy trees I'd spent years feeding it. It used a newer interface now, prettier than mine, with dashboards built for boardroom screenshots. But underneath those paint layers, it still pulsed with the same logic, the same precision-weighted variables, the same tolerance mapping. Still me. They had phased me out, but they hadn't understood what they were still using, and that was their first mistake. A week after they dropped me, I found myself in my garage staring at a half-empty toolbox. I hadn't been sleeping well. My mind still spun through calibration matrices and failover ratios like an engine trying to start without fuel. Around 2 a.m., with no better idea, I fired up an old laptop I used to keep for sandbox modeling. Buried in that creaky hard drive was a virtual environment I hadn't touched in years. I booted it up out of habit more than hope. Back then, I'd set it up to test latency variations in routing paths, nothing flashy, just a closed-loop sim with modular tracing tools. But when the artificial environment loaded, I noticed the timestamps. Latest access. Never. No one had touched it since the day I left it, which meant one thing: they didn't even know this local sandbox existed. I sunk back into the chair. In the corner of the virtual file system, under a nondescript folder named ref merge 3 old, was the base logic tree for Logipath X, the original prototype from 6 development cycles ago. I clicked it open. Plain text files loaded, each step laced with annotations in my own shorthand. v-risk, outlier flag, inchbrace, temp flux ADJ, watch for delta spikes. Don't compress load tier here dest dot weights unverified. Stuff only I would write. I used to call them breadcrumbs. As I scrolled through, the tension in my chest shifted from bitterness into something clearer focus, because there it was. A critical dependency junction, repurposed in the newer builds but never fully rewritten. And there was a problem. A variable set during a pre-routing calibration call, desfactor13, had been demoted during their last update, probably to simplify the weighting function across multi-hub routes. I could see why someone less familiar with the logic tree would flatten it. It accounted for edge case instabilities under atypical constraints. But they'd failed to realize that during mass-scale forecasting, those edge cases became the linchpin. They'd defanged the safeguard and didn't even know it. And yet the AI still dependent on the core route. Analysis routines was processing everything through a modified legacy decision tree. My decision tree. Technically degraded, but still echoing my logic layer with every calculation. It wasn't loyal, obviously no code is, but it followed patterns ingrained into its predictive architecture. They couldn't train that out, with prettier front ends and dashboard integrations. I traced through some of the archived test pathways. Inputs were still behaving as though desfactor13 ranked within the top-tier modifier class. But with its status downgraded, the forecast engine would pull incorrect depletion thresholds under real-world congestion. The AI would trust its input, and then fail to understand the variance when reality didn't match prediction. I leaned back, staring at that line of code, mouth dry. This wasn't just a flaw. This was a slow-burning error waiting to detonate under performance stress. And that gave me an idea. I wasn't thinking, revenge not yet. Something more surgical. More instructive. First, I took a snapshot image of the model tree and exported the dev notes, legacy syntax and all. Disguised, of course, I obfuscated the headers, recoded the interface language, even adjusted the annotation font so it wouldn't be recognized by any internal document matchers they had running. Then I started running simulations, changing nothing but desfactor13 status. Run after run, congestion fallout cascaded differently depending on exact calibration timing. The model didn't just miscalculate fulfillment timing, it actively overcommitted, trying to balance backorders through a stability function that no longer existed. It had an algorithmic blind spot. Subtle. Lethal. I took a walk around the block to cool my head. When I came back, I lit a candle in the tin holder my daughter made me years ago. I don't know why, ritual, maybe. Then I opened a fresh file, titled it plainly, Ghost Logic, Ops, Discrepancies. I was calm now, focused like I hadn't been in months. I wasn't going to take them down. I was going to outthink them. Quietly, elegantly, on paper. I spent the next 6 days auditing the model paths against my original framework. Line by line, I documented the divergence points. Didn't dramatize it, just metrics, deltas, tolerance stacking, inconsistencies. The AI hadn't gone rogue. It was doing exactly what they'd told it to do. Within guardrails, they hadn't realized they'd weakened. Their assumption was that they'd evolved past the founder logic. But the truth? They had simply forgotten how it actually worked, and I knew something else too. Competitors would kill to patch this exact class of failure before it hit them. Third-party firms would love to cite it as precedent. Thought leaders would share it in slideshows, thinking they'd cracked something bold and new. But they'd all be reading me. So I came up with a pseudonym, L.E. March. Reversible initials, a small nod to myself. Under that name, I started drafting an overview paper on supply chain AI dependency risks in adaptive legacy models. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but I had a feeling. Because no matter how many layers they threw on top, no matter how clean their UI or flashy their metrics underneath it all, the machine was still running on my pulse. And if I could still read its rhythm, I could still outmaneuver them. I didn't need access to their systems to make an impact. They'd cut me out, but they couldn't erase the traces of me etched into the architecture. That logic tree, they thought it was legacy code, but it was more like a skeleton key. Anyone using it without understanding the bone structure was bound to misstep. I opened a clean instance of my sandbox, isolated from any of my old directories. I named the new project Clearload. Just a placeholder, but it felt good to give it a name that wasn't tied to our old culture of half-jokes and endless rev IDs. From there, I started rebuilding the core structure of what I once designed, only smarter. Cleaner. I incorporated everything I'd learned since leaving. No shortcuts this time. Then came the clever part. Using an LLC I'd incorporated years ago for side consulting, mostly a tax shelter I never got around to using. I registered a modest service website, a tight pitch, nothing flashy. I called the firm masystems.mark and Alexa, for my daughter. Through this anonymous front, I submitted some lightweight proposals to logistics startups quietly working in the same verticals as my old company. These weren't large-scale systems yet. Most of them were still baking their AI layers, looking for efficiencies, testing ideas. But they were hungry and agile. The kind of teams that read white papers at midnight and rewrote pipelines on weekends. My proposals weren't overbearing. I packaged them as system enhancement suggestions. Root cause flow reduction here. Conditional delay management there. All phrased like peer suggestions from one developer to another. Most of these shops were too new to have the ego my old crew had. They read the code, saw the logic, and responded with curiosity. I made sure to avoid any proprietary phrases. The bones were mine, but the skin was new. The tweaks I suggested shaved milliseconds off decision cycles, improved recalculations under breakage conditions, and subtly tightened prediction intervals. Nothing radical on its face, but taken together. They described a smarter system. After the third company implemented my tweaks, I sat back and wrote the overview paper. Not a manifesto. Just a quietly laid out report that targeted a rising blind spot in AI-run logistics. The fallacy of backward compatible assumption stacks. I described examples carefully fictionalized that showcased failure points. Time lag divergence, modifier stacking errors, misaligned dependency toggles. I dropped this paper on GitChain under the pseudonym L.E. March. A small account, no real followers, but the paper wasn't designed to go viral. It just needed to pulse quietly through the right forums. I tagged it in a few niche AI infrastructure groups and sat back. Every few hours I'd check the analytics feed, slow at first, a download here, a reference click there, and then the citations started. One logistics blog referenced it within 2 days, called it a compelling breakdown of hidden fragilities in hybrid AI logic. A supply chain researcher commented on the thread, asking for thoughts on implementing protective heuristics. By day 5, someone uploaded a translated version onto a Vietnamese transportation oversight site. That surprised me, but it also told me the idea was taking on a life of its own. Still, I avoided ego. I didn't inject anything personal into the paper. No need to say I'd built what they still called their flagship optimization suite. No need to disclose that the specific error logic I highlighted was lifted from their still active forecasting model. I didn't want credit. I wanted pressure. Meanwhile, I fed data. Not to them, never to them, but to the firms I'd quietly started working with. One startup invited me in for a virtual roundtable, unaware that MA Systems was just me in a hoodie sitting in my attic. They were young, sharp, quick to absorb. I gave them just enough logic scaffolding to improve their own cascade control flow. Even under heavy stress simulations, their model maintained integrity within 3% of optimal. That was unheard of for a system that new. I pushed a few more variant tweaks through. Labeled them as patch paths. I handed them off to 2 mid-level integrators, who processed peripheral modules for logistics software vendors. Like little arteries feeding into the ecosystem, these patches would show up quietly in a dozen third-party templates over the next 6 months, and no one would know where they came from. I wasn't sabotaging my old company. I wasn't kidnapping IP or violating Clause 67B in my old exit paperwork. I'd written all of that logic by hand, long before they even considered commercial application, and here's the truth. You can't plagiarize something no one ever properly claimed. I waited, not for applause, just to see where the cracks might form once pressure returned. Call it a slow ignition, a quiet match catching dry air. I wasn't broadcasting it, I was letting it smolder. Within 3 months, the first fault line appeared. A missed delivery window on a high-volume route between their Arlington hub and the Nevada rail merge. At first glance, it looked like a rerouting buffer misfire. They tried to patch it with an incremental tightening of the AI's prediction window, but that only shifted the strain downstream. The following week, the same issue hit a Miami freight line, then Denver. The scaling mechanisms were misfiring under pressure. I recognized the signature of the error immediately. It wasn't breakdown. It was ghost logic. My original framework being pushed past its true capacity by handlers who didn't know what constrained it in the first place. Internally, they blamed bad data. Externally, they blamed vendors. I watched a LinkedIn post from their director of operations talk about unexpected supply choke points due to rising demand volatility. Corporate speak for, our model's throwing sparks and we have no extinguisher. It wasn't failing fast enough to go up in flames, just slowly enough that it kept hemorrhaging efficiency inch by inch. Meanwhile, one of the firms I'd quietly supplied tweaks to, the smallest of the 3, released a small app extension that offered real-time fulfillment heat maps. It was clean, light, stupid fast. It leveraged the very recalculation heuristics I'd layered into their core to handle timing disruptions on the fly. They began outperforming benchmarks by nearly 15%. And a few market analysts on the logistics side started drawing comparisons. Their quarterly jump earned them shadow funding from one of the same investors backing my old company, which ignited something else entirely. My former team, the ones who had walked past me like I was terminal, began scrambling. Their AI unit was still using what they called the Halper stack, a name someone once slapped onto a framework I wrote out of boredom and whiteboard caffeine at 2 in the morning. It was never meant to scale without adaptive memory integration, but they had plugged it into a newer command shell and trusted the outputs blindly. They'd sliced efficiencies by skimming surface outputs rather than sampling root response states. That shortcut was now costing them accuracy. Worse, it was spreading like a slow leak. I knew they would go looking. Soon enough, someone on the AI architecture team backtraced a modeling inconsistency in their time delay module. I saw a job posting quietly appear on a dev board. Looking for AI logic consultants with optimization layer insight, specific experience in hybrid memory prediction, matrices a plus. That was my structure. No one even called it that explicitly anymore. They were trying to remember the name of something they never even fully understood in the first place. A week later, the audit reports hit. Not public, but internal mappings always leak. A contact of mine showed me a sanitized thread and engineer's note about rate fold divergence in legacy code, traces unable to be mapped to current schema paths. In plain terms, they'd found the ghosts. The remnants of a system that adjusted not just for conditions, but for intent. The way I had designed it to track not only inputs and outputs, but the rationale that influenced route decisions in the first place. They'd never discovered that layer. Why would they? I never taught it. I never wrote it in the documentation. That was always my ace. and now it was costing them. The firm's production partner in Sao Paulo dropped 2 contracts over forecast instability. One of the analytics blogs picked up on the mismatch between reported trucking efficiency and actual fuel distribution trends. Someone asked if they were padding reports. Someone else hinted that their AI assumptions seemed lifted. Then someone referenced a citation, not of them, of my paper, the one published quietly under LE March. That was the part I didn't expect. The dots were connecting backward. My fake name was becoming an industry whisper. A few developers speculated online that the paper's examples were based on a real deployed model. One even guessed my old company by name. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence kept the myth alive. Then came the message. Buried inside a routine vendor feedback chain, there it was. A formal request for advisory review input forwarded to MA systems. Vague language. Seeking alignment on legacy system interpretations. Curious about methodology. I didn't reply right away. Let them wait. Let the cracks keep spreading. I saw another CTO resign 2 weeks later. His exit was labeled a shift toward product-focused leadership. In truth, he'd been the one who structured the AI team that bundled my system without version testing transitions. I imagined him staring at his monitor while the metrics turned red, wondering why the foundation he trusted was crumbling silently beneath him. But it wasn't sabotage. It was gravity. They had built a tower on scaffolding only I had the map for. And instead of asking how it stood, they kicked me out and painted over the cracks. Now it was all starting to lean. They reached out again about a month later. This time it was less vague. One of their senior advisors, someone I remembered from before the reorg, not entirely useless, sent a direct message through one of the industry platforms. He didn't use my name, just said he was aware of recent infrastructure inconsistencies and was hoping to open a dialogue regarding legacy insight alignment for audit clarity. That meant they were desperate. You do not go crawling back to retired engineers unless the system is bleeding at the joints. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't inclined to say anything at all. But curiosity has a pulse of its own. I traced some of their recent updates. They'd started patching over parts of the system by brute forcing newer forecasting modules onto the old interface logic, a messy, inefficient hack to blend modern spectator models into something built for reason-driven prediction. It was like asking a telescope to steer a boat. It generated noise. Worse, it broke some of the chain dependencies I had originally built to create self-correcting loops. A few vendor routes had now become entirely desynced from demand curves. I watched fulfillment windows balloon from 4-hour averages to 12, then back down to 2 at random intervals. They treated the system like a calculator. It wasn't. It was an interpreter. In private forums, a few of their engineers were beginning to ask better questions. One of them, a junior dev named Connor, who I vaguely remembered training, posted something about operational drift clustering, and asked if anyone had information on original stitch layer ratios from back in the team's deployment days. That got my attention. No one had referenced TEAMS in over a decade, because I was the only one who maintained the bridge file that connected transport heuristics to engagement heuristics. It was a shortcut I used to calculate pivot windows without forcing a full route rebalance every time a threshold changed. I designed it for flexibility. They'd mistaken it for redundancy. Eventually, they sent something official. On letterhead, potential consulting opportunity on conditional logic integration refinements. A sentence that said nothing but meant everything. I could picture them around a table, probably whiteboarding timelines and allocating a return specialist contingency fund, hoping I'd come in subdued, pen in hand, grateful for the invitation. I sent a shorter message back. No thank you. Standard rates no longer apply. I never heard back, not directly, but one of my contacts said they switched internal modeling platforms the next quarter. Fully restructured the architecture, wiped the old logic net clean, or at least tried to. But it was too late. Their performance had cratered. Vendors now built in redundancy costs just to deal with unpredictability. One of the firms I'd worked with, anonymously now larger, sharper, and fully adaptive, signed a new distribution deal in one of my former company's core regions, right where I'd once optimized route convergence into a 32-hour turnaround. And the name? March Logic, a quiet nod from the firm, drawn from the pseudonym I used for my paper. It stuck. Even now they whisper it in the industry. Some know the connection, most don't. But the idea has weight. A modeling structure that adapts to cause, not just effect. That anticipates not just when and where, but why. My ghost is deeper in the system now than I ever was as a person. The irony is, I never needed the job back. I needed the truth to surface. I needed them to feel the shape of what they had erased. Now I advise 3 firms under contract. No titles, no quarterly meetings, no politics in dress shirts, just transparent outcomes. My systems evolve faster. They correct cleanly. No more scaffolding. Just strong foundations. The kind you draw in silence, execute in hours, and refine over weeks until no human in the loop ever has to guess at intent again. I still see articles roll out every few months. Some new executive stating the importance of alignment between legacy systems and emerging inference models. I smile. They know now. Now they know what happens when you build a monument on borrowed code and evicted architects. The foundation speaks louder than memory. And memory, it turns out, knows how to replicate.